The year is 1978 and punk rock has exploded all around the world. The US scene is dominated by the art and the rejection of mainstream norms that the counterculture represents. In the UK, punk has a different edge. It's political. It stands against class inequality and the establishment. At the heart of this storm were two names that became inseparable: Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen. Sid was the bass player for the UK punk band the Sex Pistols, while his American girlfriend Nancy was a groupie in the scene, rubbing shoulders with music icons. Their relationship was fast, volatile, destructive and drug-fueled. But on October 12th, inside room 100 of New York's infamous Chelsea Hotel, Nancy would be found dead by a single stab wound to the stomach. Her death sparked one of the most infamous scandals in rock history. Was Sid Vicious, the heroin-addled Sex Pistols bassist, really her killer? Or had someone else crept into the room during the haze of drugs and chaos? In the decades since, many theories have been presented, names have been named, but the case still remains unsolved. Let's examine the case, but let's go back to the start of all of this. (1958) was an interesting year. 12 years out from World War II, and the West was experiencing large economic growth and a cultural shift. Consumerism was flourishing as the middle class boomed. This is the world baby Nancy Spungen would be born into. February 27th, 1958, Frank Spungen, a travelling salesman with his wife Deborah, would give birth to Nancy at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia. Nancy would be the first of 3 children. Later, her parents would give birth to another girl they named Susan and a boy they named David. Nancy was said to have been a troubled child. Some speculate that her antisocial behaviour and her inability to connect to other people, including her parents, may have stemmed from the life-saving blood transfusion she had to undergo the second she was born. Laying on a steel table in a surgery room while doctors worked on her, instead of having the crucial skin-to-skin bonding contact with her parents. Although Nancy was a destructive child, she excelled as a student. After being expelled from public school in her early teens, she would be sent to live in a boarding school for gifted children. It would be here where Nancy's behaviour didn't improve. She would be caught taking drugs, and on one occasion she ran away and even attempted to unalive herself by cutting her wrists. A psychiatrist would diagnose Nancy as having schizophrenia. This would see her move schools yet again, but not for long. Due to her being an exceptional student, she graduated high school in 1974 at the young age of 16. From here, Nancy would be accepted at the University of Colorado, Boulder. But 5 months into her freshman year, she would be arrested for attempting to buy marijuana from an undercover cop. This would put her in the bad books with the university, but she escaped any sort of punishment. It wasn't until Nancy was caught with stolen property inside her dorm room when the university stepped in and she was kicked out. Nancy would return to Philadelphia with her parents, but she didn't stay long. At the age of 17, Nancy jumped on a Greyhound bus, headed for New York City, where in just a few years, she would meet her demise. Almost 3,600 kilometres away in London, a 6'1" skinny 18-year-old named Simon John Ritchie is watching his friend John Lydon being recruited as the singer of a band being put together by Malcolm McLaren, the owner of a clothing shop called Sex in Chelsea. Neither Simon or Nancy knew that their paths would cross in the future, and what would transpire is a clash of two personalities, destined for self-destruction. Simon's upbringing couldn't have been further from Nancy's. He was born May 10th, 1957, to John and Anne Ritchie. John was a guardsman at Buckingham Palace, while Anne served a short stint in the British Army. But after little Simon was born, he and his mother moved to Ibiza, where his father John was supposed to meet them, but he never showed. With no financial support coming Anne's way and baby Simon to look after, she reportedly sold marijuana to get by until the British Embassy could help the young mother and a child return to the UK. Back in the UK, Simon's father John had joined the Royal Air Force, and he was largely absent from his life. By 1965, his mother Anne had married Christopher Beverley, a man who had just recently finished his service with the Royal Navy. The family would move to Kent, and for a brief period, things for little Simon seemed to improve. His home life was stable, but it wouldn't be for long. 6 months after the move, his stepfather Chris would die from cancer, and again, Anne and her 9-year-old son Simon were alone. From this point on, Simon's home life was chaotic. His mother had developed an addiction to heroin, among other drugs, and they moved around a lot. By 1971, the pair landed in East London, where Simon started to lay down some roots. By 1973, things would come to a head between Simon and his mother Anne. Anne at this stage was crippled by heroin addiction. Simon, unbeknown to her, had enrolled himself into Westminster Kingsway College, where he was attempting to finish high school. Anne would kick 16-year-old Simon out of the house, stating, "It's either you or me, and it's not going to be me. I have to try to preserve myself, and you? Just F off." In response, Simon said, "I've got nowhere to go," to which his mum's reply was, "I don't care." It would be from here, with fellow Kingsway students John Lydon, John Gray and John Wardle, that the four of them would drop out of school and squat in vacant properties around different parts of London. From here, the four teenagers would hang around Chelsea, which at the time was the centre for music and fashion. John Lydon and Simon would start busking for money, playing covers of Alice Cooper songs with passerbys paying them to stop. But by 1975, a twist of fate was about to take place. Given the fact that Simon's middle name was John, he too was called John by everyone that knew him. Malcolm McLaren had returned from New York, where a music revolution was taking place. An edgy, raw, do-it-yourself music scene had popped up, calling itself punk. Malcolm had briefly managed a band called the New York Dolls and was looking to form the UK equivalent. Malcolm's shop assistant Glenn Matlock was playing bass guitar in a band called The Strand, with his friends Paul Cook on drums, Steve Jones as the singer, and Wally Nightingale on guitar. Given the fact that Malcolm had managed the New York Dolls, the band was thrilled to have him manage them. However, Malcolm had a vision for the band, aesthetically and sound-wise, that didn't include Wally, so Wally Nightingale would be dropped from the band and replaced on guitar by singer Steve Jones, who at this point couldn't really play guitar. Now, the band needed a new singer when one of the kids suggested John. Malcolm, not realising that they meant Simon John Ritchie, thought they were talking about John Lydon, and he was asked to become the new singer of the band. The Strand would change their name to the Sex Pistols, and aesthetically, they were kitted out with clothing from Malcolm's own clothing store. And this is where a scene was starting to take shape. Simon by this stage had been given the nickname Sid Vicious by John Lydon, due to John's hamster named Sid biting Simon. John Lydon, on the other hand, would be nicknamed Johnny Rotten by Sex Pistols guitarist Steve Jones due to his bad teeth. So Sid, now seeing his friend Johnny Rotten playing in a band, decided that he wanted to form his own one, with himself as the vocalist. The band called themselves the Flowers of Romance. The interesting thing about this band, although they didn't last long, the members included future Clash guitarist Keith Levine and the Slits Palmolive and Viv Albertine, who were instrumental in the formation of the punk scene in the UK in the late 1970s. Now this is where things take an interesting turn. Sid had hit onto drummer Palmolive, who rejected his advances, so he kicked her out of the band. The Flowers of Romance would break up without ever having performed live or recorded any music. Sid would play drums for Susie and the Banshees before being asked to play bass guitar for the Sex Pistols in early 1977. Original bass player Glenn Matlock, and a former employee of Malcolm McLaren, had quit the band because, as he put it, he was sick of their bullshit. Malcolm had been pushing the band members to be as outrageous as possible because, as he saw it, it was good for publicity. Sid Vicious had been a regular attendee at the concerts and was noted by many there to be a wild character. Dressed in a studded leather jacket, tall with spiky hair, he was often assaulting people at random in the crowd. Malcolm saw this and thought he'd be perfect for the band. But Sid, he didn't know how to play bass guitar. In an interview for the documentary Punk Attitude, Chrissie Hynde from The Pretenders explained that Sid taught himself bass by staying up for 3 nights on speed and playing along to Ramones songs. But under the surface, as everything is starting to happen, many people around Sid had known that he had started to develop a pretty bad drug habit. And worst of all, he was allegedly getting the drugs off his own mum. Back in New York, Nancy Spungen had carved out a life for herself in the now established New York punk scene. She was a regular at CBGB's, one of the famous clubs that played host to the rebellious counterculture. Nancy had become a groupie, following bands like the Ramones, the Heartbreakers and the New York Dolls everywhere they would go. Unlike most groupies, who were stick skinny, claiming to be aspiring models or actresses, Nancy made no bones about who she was. She was a drug addict who would support herself through drug dealing and part-time sex work. The Heartbreakers would go on an overseas tour, and it would be in London where Nancy would meet the Sex Pistols. Her eyes initially were on frontman Johnny Rotten, but he rejected her advances. So she set her sights on Sid Vicious, their new bass player. Instantly, the pair bonded and became a couple. Nancy outspoken and crass, while Sid, deep down, shy and quiet. Their opposite personalities attracted each other, like a magnet to a fridge. In March of 1977, Sid and Nancy would move in together, living in various places around West London. It's during this time that both of their drug habits started to spiral more and more out of control. Sid, by this point, is barely functional. He's so high on heroin. When the Sex Pistols headed back into the studio to finish off their one and only album, Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, Sid's bass parts had to be redone by guitarist Steve Jones. Sid's timing was so far out that it was unusable. In another incident, Sid, high on drugs, stumbled into the recording room where rock band Queen were about to start a session. Sid mocked frontman Freddie Mercury by saying he was bringing ballet back, before being escorted out of the room. But with the drug use aside, the violence was next level. In an infamous incident at the Speakeasy Club, a London bar frequented by musicians and music industry professionals, a fight broke out between the Sex Pistols and BBC DJ Bob Harris and his crew. The Sex Pistols, with broken bottles in hand, demanded to know when they would be on the show, with Sid Vicious jamming the jagged glass bottle into the face of sound engineer George Nicholson. For this incident, no arrest would be made, but the Sex Pistols would be dropped by their record label A&M, with their music banned on all Capital Radio-owned stations. In May of 1977, the Sex Pistols released their single God Save the Queen to a mixed reception. The lyrics, God Save the Queen, a fascist regime, angered many in the British society, and this resulted in a razor attack on Johnny Rotten and two of his associates as they left a pub in Islington, North London. The original pressing of the single under A&M, who produced 25,000 copies but later destroyed most of them, is considered to be one of the most valuable records of all time. In 2024, at an auction, an original God Save the Queen single produced by A&M sold for over £24,000. After being dropped by A&M, a young record shop owner, Richard Branson, who had started his own label, Virgin Records, Richard would pick the band up, signing them to his label. In celebration of the signing and due to the Sex Pistols being banned on mainstream radio stations all through the UK, Richard hired a cruise boat to sail through the Thames where the band played the songs God Save the Queen and Anarchy in the UK. This resulted in the police showing up and arresting the organisers of the event. From here, the Sex Pistols would tour Europe with Nancy Spungen in tow. Nancy had developed a reputation and was nicknamed Nauseating Nancy by other people in and around the scene. It was while in France, after a massive fight with Sid, when Nancy threatened to unalive herself, cutting herself with a knife. This would be one of the first major incidences for outsiders to the relationship that set off alarm bells that something is deeply wrong here. Nancy was prone to depression and violent outbursts, largely due to her heavy drug dependency. If she felt Sid was at risk of leaving her, she would threaten self-harm. Back in London, things continued to spiral even further. Malcolm McLaren and the other band members of the Sex Pistols wanted Nancy gone. She was banned from touring with them. Although in the early stages with Sid, he was encouraged to be as destructive as possible, be it when he was a fan of the band in the crowd to when he became a fully fledged member. Malcolm saw it as good for publicity. If Johnny Rotten was the voice of punk, Sid Vicious was the attitude. Sid was viewed to embody what being a punk rocker was all about. But alarm bells started ringing, and the sound was deafening. Now the thoughts were, how can we help Sid? In early 1978, the Sex Pistols would head to the United States of America to tour their album, Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, released months before. This would be the beginning of the end for the band. Instead of heading to New York, where the punk scene was very much in full swing, Malcolm McLaren, always wanting controversy, started the US tour in the Deep South. This was a calculated move to create as much chaos around the show as possible, and history predicted it. In the 1950s, conservative-leaning folks in the same cities the Sex Pistols would tour in protested against the formation of rock and roll. And true to form, the crowds showed up in force. Many considered the band dangerous to nice conservative values, so the atmosphere was intense. Fights would break out, and on top of this, Sid Vicious, at the behest of the Warner Brothers music label overseeing the tour, insisted that he overcome his heroin addiction, so he was prescribed methadone and was in a constant state of withdrawal. Nancy had been banned from touring with the band, so tensions between Sid and the other members was at a fever pitch. In San Francisco on January 14th, 1978, playing their 7th show, the band imploded, and the Sex Pistols were finished. Singer Johnny Rotten returned to the UK immediately, angry at Malcolm McLaren for the predicament he had put the band in, among other things. Guitarist Steve Jones and drummer Paul Cook went to Los Angeles for a time before moving back to London. Sid Vicious would leave San Francisco and head straight to New York City to be with Nancy Spungen. And in just 9 months, Nancy would be dead. And in 13, Sid would be too. As the plane landed at JFK Airport in New York, Sid Vicious would be rushed to the hospital. On the flight, he had slipped into a drug-induced coma due to a cocktail of drugs and alcohol. In the hospital, the doctors would tell him that if he didn't quit drinking, he'd be dead in 6 months. After being stabilised and after a few days, he was released and reunited with Nancy. Between his arrival to New York and up until April that year in 1978, these months are largely referred to as the lost months. What we know is, although Sid was still recovering from his overdose, he was still actively using heroin with Nancy. Nancy, by this stage, was acting as his manager and attempting to link him up with musicians in the New York punk scene. It was widely speculated that the couple were making money by Nancy doing part-time sex work from time to time in order to get the couple's next drug fix. Nancy would also ask her parents for money, sometimes telling them that she needed a kidney transplant in order to get the cash. Malcolm McLaren was pondering his next moves after the Sex Pistols had broken up, and Sid Vicious, in his eyes, was the next big thing. A movie, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, was currently in the works, a mockumentary about the formation and breakup of the Sex Pistols. Straight away, former lead singer Johnny Rotten wanted nothing to do with it, but the rest of the band were happy for the paycheck. From here, Sid and Nancy would fly to France in April, where Sid would perform a cover of Frank Sinatra's My Way with French musicians. Some filming of the movie would take place in and around Paris, but Sid and Nancy would fly to London, where the majority of the filming was happening. It was in London where they would link up with Sex Pistols' first bass player, Glenn Matlock, and they would perform in clubs around Camden. Nancy would sing backing vocals while Sid was the lead singer. The couple had asked Glenn if they could put something together as they were running low of money and needed to fly back to New York City. With the cash in hand, the couple boarded a flight from Heathrow and headed back to the United States. Back in New York, the couple checked themselves into the infamous Chelsea Hotel. Their room number is 100 on the first floor. Their next door neighbour is a punk rocker and alleged drug dealer, Neon Leon. Hotel staff would note to the police how they often saw the couple walking around dazed, with Nancy frequently showing bruises on her face and black eyes. Other hotel guests would claim to have heard violent fights coming from their hotel room. It's from here that Nancy starts booking shows for Sid to play at Max's Kansas City Club in New York. Sid is now the frontman of a band pieced together with other musicians from the scene, mostly former New York Dolls members. Sid, by this stage, had well and truly developed a reputation for being too out of it to perform. And true to form, on some nights, that's exactly what had happened. You see, for Sid Vicious, he was famous in the London punk scene, but in New York, many people didn't know who he was. Well, just yet anyway. With some money coming in from Sex Pistols royalties and the shows played around New York, the couple were financially pretty stable at this point. Nancy acted as the bank for the couple, often carrying around large bags full of cash. Sometimes she'd be so out of it, the cash would be dropping out of the bag and onto the floor, as she and Sid staggered back to their hotel room after a big night out. But by the 11th of October 1978, things were going to change forever. Nancy had always told people that she wanted to die before the age of 21, and that night, that prediction was about to come true. Now, reports are conflicting, but this seems to be the most legitimate account. Sid had just been paid over $3,000 for his performances at Max's Kansas City Club in New York, as well as having been sent money from Malcolm McLaren for his role in the movie. The couple had a large pile of cash in the room sitting in a closed drawer by the bed. The couple hosted a party at their hotel room. People throughout the night would come and go, and it's here where people would see Sid take as many as 30 Tuinol, which is essentially a depressant that makes you feel relaxed and at ease. Tuinol was heavily abused in the punk rock scene in the 1970s, but to take 30 of them, the person runs the risk of an overdose. And many people on the night noticed Sid slip into a comatose state on the bed. By 1:30 a.m, Nancy would call a friend and drug dealer Rockets Red Glare because she wanted to buy Diluted, a synthetic form of morphine. He would arrive shortly after with drugs in hand. Now this is the part of the story that gets confusing, but I'm going to lay it all out on the table and let the viewer, you, decide for yourself. Rockets claimed to a Rolling Stones magazine reporter that he left around 5 a.m. As he was leaving, he saw another drug supplier heading to the elevator. The supplier would later be identified as Neon Leon, the musician who lived next door to Sid and Nancy. Leon would later be found in possession of Sid's famous black studded leather jacket and other Sex Pistols memorabilia, including gold records that he claimed Nancy had left at their door at roughly 3 a.m. Rockets denies these claims. Another story was that Nancy had bought another drug dealer's entire drug supply, when at 3 a.m, the dealer appeared wanting some of it back, to which she said no, and she was attacked while Sid was passed out on the bed. It would be around 7:30 in the morning when guests would hear a woman moaning in pain. The sound was coming from room 100. By 10 a.m, someone called the front desk, alerting them to the fact that it sounded like someone was dying in the room and to call the police. When the police arrived, Sid was found wandering the hallway in a daze. As the police entered the room, there was blood all over the bed, leading to the bathroom where deceased Nancy Spungen lay crumpled under the bathroom sink next to the toilet. Sid would be arrested on the spot and later booked for murder. Reports from the police claim that he initially confessed to the crime, but conveniently, there was no tape recording. I mean, these are NYPD cops in the late 1970s. Corruption was rampant. Downtown, Sid would be held in jail until a court appearance. Back in the room, no drugs or money were found. Police snatched it up to opportunistic addicted friends stealing from them in the aftermath, including Neon Leon. Sid would be released on a $50,000 bond paid by Virgin Records, and he would be given an attorney by the label. Friends of the couple stood firmly to Sid's defence, claiming that he would never hurt Nancy. Even New York punk rockers closer to Nancy than him. It is alleged that while he was at Rikers Island prison waiting for bail, Sid was raped by other inmates. However, this hasn't been confirmed. Once out, Sid is put on methadone and encouraged to finally quit heroin. Sid's mother Anne had flown into town, having raised the money through selling her story to the New York Post. On the 22nd of October, so not even 2 weeks since Nancy was found dead in the Chelsea hotel, Sid attempts his own life. He takes all of his methadone supply at once and slashes his wrists. His mother Anne finds him in the bathroom and calls Malcolm McLaren, who races over. When Malcolm arrives, Sid is begging them to help him end his life. He would be rushed to the hospital and stitched up. Less than 1 week later, he would make another attempt, this time using a broken light bulb. Sid was withdrawing from heroin and was in a constant state of agony, so he started using again. By the 9th of December, so almost 2 months later, Sid is dating Michelle Robinson when the couple are at Harrah's Disco in New York. Sid is checking out the girlfriend of Todd Smith, Patti Smith's brother, when Todd confronts him. A fight breaks out and Sid stabs Todd with a broken beer bottle. For this, he would be arrested again and sent back to Rikers Island. 7 weeks later, and after a full heroin detox, Sid is released on a further $10,000 bond footed by Virgin Records. He meets up with his mother Anne and some of the punks in the New York scene, including Jerry Only of the Misfits and Jerry Nolan of the Heartbreakers. They all head over to Sid's girlfriend's apartment in Greenwich Village for a night of partying. The celebration was for Sid's release. It was while here that Sid partook in the heroin that was available, but given that he had detoxed and the strength of the heroin batch provided, it instantly sent Sid into a nod. Jerry Onley would pick Sid up and start slapping him around in an attempt to wake him up, but Sid's mum intervened. Jerry said he's been in prison for 2 months, so you know he's clean, you can't be messing with him. Sid would be helped to his girlfriend's bedroom where he would lay down to rest. It would be around midnight when he would wake up and was begging for another fix. Allegedly, it would be his mother Anne who would go into the room and shoot him up. The next morning, Simon John Ritchie, better known as Sid Vicious, would be found dead. His mother Anne would later admit to giving him too much heroin so that he would OD. She claimed that Sid and Nancy had an unaliving pact. Now let's examine some of the other crucial details or rumours involved in the case. If Sid and Nancy did in fact have an unaliving pact and that on the 11th of October 1978 they had enacted that very plan, as the note found in Sid's leather jacket the next year suggests, then it stands to reason that Sid and Nancy may very well have given Neon Leon their prized punk memorabilia, including the original studded leather jacket he wore with the Sex Pistols, as when he got out of prison and up until the day he died, he was never seen wearing it again. And with that logic, it also stands to reason that Nancy may have self-inflicted the stab wound, as she had taken a knife to herself in the past. And maybe Sid's method was to OD, which would explain why he was so out of it when the police turned up. But I think most likely, if such a plan did in fact exist, it was probably along the lines of, if you die, I want to die with you. The usual toxic teenage love that has existed forever. Other rumours would float around that Rocket's red glare had killed Nancy while Sid was passed out on the bed, and that months later he showed friends money with blood on it, claiming he had stolen it from the room afterwards. It's possible. Allegedly, Neon Leon had told someone that he knew who the killer was, and that he never told the police. Another name that pops up is English Mick, allegedly a punk rocker and drug dealer around the time. People have linked him to the murder of Nancy, claiming that he may very well have been the dealer who needed his supply back at 3 AM. But the police will have you believe that Sid Vicious, in a fit of rage and a stomach full of Tuinol, killed Nancy, then either went back to sleep or tried to OD himself, while other addicts ransacked the hotel room, stealing their cash and drugs. Which is possible. So what's the truth? I think it lays somewhere in the middle. I think it's very plausible Sid killed Nancy. He most certainly had laid hands on her in the past. Creating this video, it's hard not to notice the black eyes on Nancy in some of the pictures. But I also think it's very possible that Nancy did it to herself, trying to get Sid's attention. But Sid, being in the state he was in, wasn't able to do anything. Maybe he felt guilt over that. I also think it's very possible that someone else killed Nancy to steal their money and drugs. In the haste of leaving with the loot, they left other valuables in a room that other people like Neon Leon swooped in and stole. I think the truth lay somewhere in between those scenarios. As for Sid Vicious's death, I do think his mum shooted him up with the lethal shot. I think she knew that the legal system would find him guilty and he'd be serving 20 to life. Sid's ashes would be scattered over the grave of Nancy Spungen in the Jewish cemetery she was buried in, against her parents' wishes. Sid's mum Anne Beverly would pass away on September 6, 1996 at the age of 63. Nancy's father Frank would pass in 2010, aged 76, while her mother Deborah would pass in 2024 at the age of 87. Sex Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren would die in 2010 at 64, accredited with claiming that he exploited the punk rock era of the 1970s to make money, bolstering Johnny Rotten's claims all along. Richard Branson, the owner of Virgin Records, went on to start an airline and he became a billionaire, living on an island. The original lineup of the Sex Pistols would do a world tour in 1996, But after that, Johnny Rotten, who goes by his real name John Lydon, quit the band for a second time to pursue his own musical endeavour, Public Image. Today the other members tour with vocalist Frank Carter. John Lydon claims it's karaoke. Punk rock started as a furious rejection of the bloated music at the time. It was fast, loud and raw. Anybody with a pulse could play it, which made it accessible to everyone. You didn't need to be a Jimmy Page-skilled guitarist to start a band. The punk attitude rose up from the wreckage of the hippie dream when peace and love faded due to suburban decline with the rise of drugs and crime. Rage and noise took its place. It was confrontational, because it needed to be. Although its light burnt bright and fast in the wake, it left a new era of music, one that encouraged a more DIY approach. It redefined fashion, art and culture. But as for Nancy Spungen's death, although I couldn't solve the case on who killed Nancy, which is why you watched this video in the first place, I will leave you with the famous words of Johnny Rotten at the Sex Pistols' final show in San Francisco, way back in 1978.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Good night.